Mm, my video. There we go. So yeah, go ahead with the discussion with with what questions are on your mind, or if anyone had any comments on what was said.
Well, that was a great summary and overview, Timothy. And I guess one place I'd like to inquire more into with you all is what Whitehead says in regard to German idealism. And he mentions it 2 or 3 times in the chapter. He closes the chapter by saying that what the German idealist movement accomplished in the domains of ethics and aesthetics needs in the next century to be integrated with contemporary science. But I don't get the sense that he was very familiar with the primary texts of Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel. I know he was surrounded by British idealists who were mostly Hegelian, but I get the sense that he did not realize the extent to which Schelling in particular was really immersed in the science of his day, and in fact arrived at a conception of nature as organic, very much in line with Whitehead's own account. And so it strikes me as like a missed opportunity for him, despite his tendency to kind of dwell in the history of modern philosophy. He unfortunately didn't. He was mostly looking at Kant and then a bit of Leibniz, but it didn't spend much time with the other post-Kantian idealists. And I think that's unfortunate because he might have gotten a leg up on his own project, with some of the work that Schelling had already done. And are any of you familiar with Schelling's philosophy of nature a little bit? I mean, in short, Schelling takes some hints from Kant's critique of judgment, and tries to show how, if we can have, if artistic genius can sort of tap into the formative power of nature, then why can't we have scientific genius that can grasp organism as constitutive of nature, right? Kant wouldn't allow that, but Schelling makes the case that no, we can, in fact, know nature as organic through and through. And, this was without the aid of electromagnetism and quantum theory that Whitehead was able to build on in the 20th century. Some have argued that Schelling actually helped Faraday and Maxwell connect electricity and magnetism. They did the mathematical heavy lifting, and experimental work, but Schelling sort of brought the concepts of electricity and magnetism into a polarity that was highly suggestive. But in any event, I just felt like it was a missed opportunity on Whitehead's part, not recognizing the continuity of his philosophy of organism with Schelling's work. Schelling's kind of an atypical idealist in that, he really tried to do justice to nature in a way that, to the reality of nature and the life of nature in a way that I guess especially Fichte didn't acknowledge. But I think even more so than Hegel, Schelling really makes nature, puts nature at the center and the core of his philosophizing, whereas Hegel had a more spiritual bent, let's say. But yeah, I mean, I just wanted to bring that point in because a lot of my work now is trying to tease out these connections, conceptual resonances between Schelling and Whitehead. And I hadn't read this chapter in a while, and it just struck me that he really overlooked that, the work that Schelling had already done.
I mean, I think, yeah, his canonizing of Western philosophy is very, very limited, actually. Like, he says that this is something encapsulating like the 3 centuries of philosophizing, and I guess this, I mean, even like to take into account thinkers like Nietzsche, perhaps, or Schopenhauer and people like that, I think would be, I mean, especially in regards to Nietzsche, I think it would be very productive. But there are also a whole plethora of other authors that seem to, if not lend themselves, at least are not very apt to be incorporated in this schema of like it's naturalistic philosophy on one side, or what we could call it like 17th century philosophy on one side, and then philosophy of the organism on the other.
I think Whitehead did end up reading Nietzsche later after this book was written. I think one of his students, I think it was Charles Hartshorne, gave him a copy of Will to Power, and Whitehead, his copy of it is preserved and it's all marked up, and he seems to have really appreciated that notion and felt aligned with it. This is a work where Nietzsche is talking about reality as being composed of these like centers of force, almost like I guess it's sometimes called perspectivalism, like each center of force brings forth its own perspective. It's very much in line with what Whitehead's articulating here. But he doesn't write much about Nietzsche. I don't think he felt comfortable because he just, he probably only read a dozen pages or so. Timothy, you'd raised this question about whether Whitehead's account of the psychological field still can be critiqued as somewhat solipsistic, and how he gets out of that. I thought you addressed that well, but there was this point he makes on what page is this? 150, where he says right at the bottom, we must allow for the possibility that we can detect in ourselves direct aspects of the mentalities of higher organisms. The claim that the cognition of alien mentalities must necessarily be by means of indirect inferences from aspects of shape and of sense objects is wholly unwarranted by his own philosophy of organism. What he's suggesting here, in Process and Reality, he'll just admit that his philosophy of organism implies a kind of telepathy. In other words, there's internal relationships among actual entities, such that, elsewhere he'll talk about feelings of sympathy. And I think telepathy is more of a charged word. Sympathy, we can understand, I think without too much of a stretch, that, he's talking about, for example, the way we can, the way we interact with dogs, we can feel what they're feeling, and we know that they have emotional states. It's more obvious in the case of human beings. So I think what he's trying to resist is this more Cartesian understanding of, I guess, what nowadays psychologists or cognitive scientists would call a theory of mind, as if we have to build up via inference from sensory perceptions what another person might be feeling. And I think there is some degree of, that going on sort of in a second order way in our reflection. We can refine what we initially experience as sympathy in a more cognitive way, but that Whitehead's point is that the basis of any reflective theory of mind is going to be these feelings of sympathy, whereby we are in direct contact with the interior states of the organisms in our environment, and that through a process of prehension, we're literally incorporating aspects of the organisms in our environment, incorporating even their subjective experiences as they perish and are transmitted to us into our own subjective experience. And so that there's no, there's no solipsism in his scheme, because we're literally, each moment of our own experience is made of the transmitted or perished feelings transmitted to us from the organisms in our environment. And so I think this is one of the more potentially radical claims that he's making that really refigures, our understanding of how human consciousness relates to the rest of the world.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I guess, and it's all, I think what's radical is that it's grounded in a different conception of what consciousness is, or what its function is. Like, let's say the basic distinction as I see it is that cognitive science still proceeds usually in a very kind of representational terms. Like, when you want to understand somebody, you want to represent in your own head what he or she is thinking, or somehow grasp some aspects of their mind, right? Whereas he tries to understand, I think, individual consciousness as a kind of structure of self-preservation or self-unfolding, and then relationships to others are also thought in terms of the way our interactions help or diminish our capacities for self-structurations. And in this sense, I think it gets very interesting for me. I find this very close to me, this notion. But I also see some problems in Whitehead. Namely, this is what I wanted to say, but I think I didn't take enough time to explain it, is that I think the problem is that we still have this dual notion of, I mean, prehension is a kind of what's the word, relational notion, and it's asymmetric in the sense that what I prehend, I always prehend as a kind of larger top-down unity, and I prehend parts of my, say, like prehend pieces of my being, of what constitutes my individual stability, let's say. So I can prehend others as a kind of, let's say, not tools, but means of achieving my own stability. Or you could turn this the other way around, which I think he does in this very sentence that you mentioned, Matt, where he says that you can be prehended by a higher kind of mentality, in the sense that you can only be a part of a higher mentality, or you can prehend lower mentalities, or let's say patterns. And what I'm asking, and what I'm interested in is, can we approach through this framework a kind of democratic, let's say, relationship, like, or say horizontal relationships between different patterns or events or beings, which aren't, let's say, non like symmetrical relations.
Yeah, I mean, I think when he's trying to describe the relationships of prehension among the parts of an animal organism's body, he does, he speaks in terms of like the transmission of series of modifications that descend from the whole to the parts. But I think he sees, I mean, there are these sorts of hierarchies of feeling in nature. Otherwise, we wouldn't have unity of experience, he thinks. There needs to be a process whereby a diversity of prehensions are brought under contrast and gradually achieve some sense of aesthetic unity. In later books, he'll call it in a dominant monad, kind of drawing on Leibniz a bit. But he also talks about, the plant realm, which is organized differently. He says animal bodies are organized like monarchies and plant bodies are organized like democracies. And I think the animal form of organization is relatively rare in nature. And, he'll say things like, in Process and Reality, he says, we find ourselves in a buzzing world amidst a democracy of fellow creatures. And by creatures, he means his actual occasions of experience. And so it's almost like the foundational level is this democratic relationship among prehensive unifications, but part of the evolutionary process and its movement towards greater complexity is, to develop these hierarchies of feeling, which is what culminates in consciousness and cognition, which, for Whitehead, most experience is not cognitive. Most experience isn't a matter of knowledge. There's nothing that you don't need. Experience doesn't need to be known in order to occur, right? Consciousness is this function of knowing experience. And he thinks that does require this, this hierarchy of feeling whereby some unity or whole is achieved that has in that way diminished the importance of the parts, but the parts serve the achievement of that whole or that unity. So yeah, there's hierarchy and democracy.
Yeah, go ahead, Miha.
I was actually reminded when you mentioned, Matt, this notion of telepathy and what's the other thing? Not telepathy, but
Sympathy.
Sympathy, yes, sympathy. I'm always going back to Alexander because I'm, I guess, a bit fascinated by him as of late, and it's interesting how Alexander is pondering this question of cognition, right? He is trying to base it primarily as a relation like any other, like a relation of a chair to the table, really. The only caveat, I suppose, is that we are enmeshed in this special kind of relation, right? We are cognizing about something. So it's not like we can just look at a relation of a chair next to a table. We can also experience this relation. This is the bonus here, right, of this cognizing relation. And it's interesting how he frames it. He frames it as a kind of togetherness. And it's really weird how he's speaking of it. He says, if I'm watching a horse, right, I am cognizing the horse and the horse is together with me. He literally says it like that. And this togetherness amounts to, and it's so fascinating, the word he uses. He says, the horse is compressant with myself as the enjoying, cognizing, I guess, being, right, which is just amazing because, well, Whitehead uses the notion of concrescence, really. So it's just such a similar sounding word in itself already, but not just similarly sounding, but it actually signifies something very similar, right? This togetherness, right? Yeah, I guess this is what I'm always reminded of, I guess, when I guess try to understand his notion of, I guess, relations, right? This togetherness, because it's such a weird thing because you don't usually think of it in these terms. That when I'm cognizing something, I am together with that thing, which is such an interesting notion.
Yeah, just this is what this conception of cognition follows, from his critique of substance, whereas we would in a substance ontology, if we were to ask, where is the sun, which is an example he uses, well, it's over there and it's separate from us and we maybe sense its effects upon us. But Whitehead's actually saying, well, the sun or any thing, what we would usually tend to call or think of as a substance, is wherever its activity extends. And so the activity of the sun is with us. We feel it because it is partaking in us and we are partaking in it. I don't know that the sun feels us as importantly in its experience as we feel it, you know, but nonetheless, there's a mutual relationship there. And, you know, certainly the Earth as a whole has an influence on the sun. A slight wobble, you know, in the sun can be detected as a result of the Earth and the other planets, but we're in a way inside the sun, and the sun is in a way inside of us, right? This is kind of what he gets into in that earlier chapter. Was it the 18th century when he talks about Bishop Berkeley's understanding of space, and you know how we, you know, where he develops his conception of prehension. And so there's this mutual sort of indwelling of the various entities in nature through this prehensive relationship.
I would actually just add, since we mentioned already this, I guess, German idealist tradition, and you're interested, I think, as you pointed out, like Schelling, right, and Goethe as well. Actually, funny enough, there's another Alexander who I guess I'm interested in here, right? It's Alexander von Humboldt, who's who was, I guess, one of those pioneers, and who really put forth this notion of an interconnected environment, right? And it's funny enough because he was also really in touch with Goethe at the period of his life, of Goethe's life, where he was writing, or he's starting to write, I think, what's the book on plants?
Metamorphosis of Plants.
Metamorphosis of Plants. Again, another very interesting character, right? Really, I guess, a pioneer in this notion of interconnectivity, and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Humboldt was one of Darwin says one of his most important influences. Darwin wouldn't have gone on his trip on the Beagle unless he had read Humboldt's account of traveling to South America. And that whole organic, what we would call now ecological awareness that Humboldt had was very much shaping Darwin's imagination. And yet, well, just to say that, you know, I think Darwin and the more predominant conception of evolutionary biology nowadays is lacking this awareness of the lineage here, that there's actually, and there's a scholar, Robert Richards, who's written a lot about this, the romantic Darwin, basically, and that this romantic conception of nature was very present in Darwin's work, and that's just been kind of lost and forgotten by the emphasis on more reductionistic methods and molecular biology and the mechanistic conception of nature. So I think pulling on these threads again that, you know, connect Darwin back to Humboldt and Goethe and Schelling would reveal a totally different, you know, I guess, alternative history we could tell of the emergence of biology and evolutionary theory. You know, Whitehead does put a lot of weight on William James's philosophy as inaugurating this new epoch. And I think maybe at Harvard, a decade after James had died, when Whitehead got there and was teaching, it might have seemed like, oh yes, this will be the Jamesian century, but it didn't pan out that way. And you know, I can think of different reasons why, you know, just the rise of analytic philosophy and the effect of the wars, the world wars, in kind of leading to this hesitance to engage in a kind of speculative philosophy, the rise of science, and the impact of, one of the turning points that's often pointed to by historians is Bergson's debate and arguments with Einstein, that this really shaped the public understanding of the relationship between science and philosophy. And because Bergson seems to have made a few scientific mistakes, philosophers were worried, in the wake of that encounter between Bergson and Einstein, that, well, we better just sort of toe the line for science, or we'll risk being dismissed as, merely, artists or psychologists or what have you, as Bergson was by some. But I wonder what you all think about this. Whitehead seems to have, maybe he was a century early, and in the 21st century, we'll look back and say, yes, we should have followed the Jamesian route and the Whiteheadian route. But so far, 100 years after Whitehead, that's not at all how things have unfolded. I think Deleuze helped generate more interest in Bergson again, but James, I don't know how he's received in Europe, but even in America, he's not discussed as much as I'd like to see by philosophers.
Never read a single work by James.
I mean, personally, I'm just familiar with James through Whitehead, so that's not a fair argument, I guess, to make, really, from my part. What at least I found interesting is that both Whitehead, William James, and Bergson were interested. I mean, were partially referencing all of them, more or less, Zenon's paradox. I know there's this similarity between the three, right? They're really interested. James is very interested in his, what is it again? Spacious present, right? He's working this notion out. Bergson is really, really interested in time, for instance, right? And Whitehead is, I guess, kind of, maybe it's too much to phrase it this way, but I guess trying to marry the two, I suppose, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of aspect of temporality which Whitehead really wants to take seriously, right? He doesn't want to, I guess, dissolve causality, right, into being a mere non-concept as Hume did, for instance. And he also wants to, I guess, preserve a kind of reality for, I guess, this present moment as well, right? So again, it does not, I guess, disappear into just being an infinite series of possible divisions of, I guess, a time period or something. And again, Alexander is doing basically something similar as well. He uses actually the phrase, "we must take time seriously," right? So I guess there's this aspect of temporality, or causality, I suppose, that I guess is tying them. I mean, it's one of many, I guess, threads that is connecting them, at least as far as my understanding of these thinkers goes. But as far as the reception of William James, I guess, at least in our faculty, I mean, I'm speaking for myself here, but he's not really mentioned that much. Maybe I think we mentioned him a bit in cognitive philosophy or something that we have. Timothy, I think maybe you know Markic. He mentions.
He was mentioned, but he wasn't on the reading.
He is partially mentioned, so that we know that he existed, I suppose.
Yeah, he's usually mentioned in relation to his theory of emotions. in
Yeah.
cognitive science. Yeah, we treated that, but that's basically it. We never really dealt with his whole psychological system. Yeah.
But to respond to your more broadly to your question, like, is the 21st century going to be Whiteheadian? I was thinking perhaps at least in line of like cognitive science development. It seems that perhaps it could be, right. I mean, if you trace like the paradigmatic shifts, we've gone from very like hard-boiled representationalist realism to enactivism, which seems at least it seems to be like almost the predominant frame of thought in cognitive sciences, and maybe like predictive processing, I think also has some similarities to this kind of approach. Actually, I was greatly reminded of Goldstein, where I was doing some predictive processing texts. But anyway, what I was thinking about was maybe precisely that. What a shame! For me, it seems almost a kind of shame that a pity that that enactivism in Varela's thinking came so heavily to rely on phenomenology. I think this was like, at least in my opinion, it was a misstep, and it would benefit much more greatly by authors such as perhaps Whitehead or like maybe Deleuze even, or people who are more in line with the kind of transcending of the subject-object dualism, not trying to ground the research again on some kind of fundamental being, such as Husserl, let's say, transcendental subject. It could be debated, it could be argued like that Merleau-Ponty's philosophy goes beyond this. But still, I think there are authors such as Whitehead, I think, offer a very great, I mean, are very much in line and perhaps go further in this direction that I think enactivism always wanted to go.
Yeah, I totally agree 100%. There's a paper that Varela wrote with Andreas Weber. I think it was his last paper. It was published in 2002, Life After Kant. And it begins with a quote from Whitehead. And they sort of develop a notion of what they call the subject pole, which is very Whiteheadian. And but still in that paper, it's as close as Varela comes, I think, to a fully organic conception of nature as a whole, but they still stop at the cell and say that the cell bootstraps itself out of the realm of neutral physics and chemistry and establishes a center of concern or a subject pole. So it's not fully Whiteheadian. It's not panpsychist, it's biopsychist, I would say. And, you know, I've been, more than 10 years kind of poking Evan Thompson to get him to read more Whitehead. And I won't take full credit, but he has, and I'm really excited to see how the whole inactive approach to cog side develops now. His new book that's going to be coming out that he's co-authored on the blind spot apparently is drawing a lot on Whitehead. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how the marriage of a kind of Whiteheadian ontology with the inactive and autopoetic approach, you know, in the life sciences and the cognitive sciences. You know, I'm excited to see how those two come together. Because you're right, if we're limited to this phenomenological approach, then it's almost like a form of idealism, rather than this provisional realism that Whitehead is trying to articulate. And I think the philosophy of organism Whitehead articulates provides, it's almost seamless, like the perfect ontology for the inactive approach to cognitive science. Or you could say it puts this autopoetic biology and inactive cognitive science in a cosmological context that really enhances a sense of continuity of all the levels of nature. So I'm very excited by this turn that Evan's work has taken more towards Whitehead.
It's interesting that both you said about Whitehead that it's a shame that he didn't know the German idealist tradition better and then refer to it more. And you have this similar phenomenon with Varela. He knew certain thinkers very well and constantly referred to them, was constantly inspired by them, whereas he seemed to have been completely oblivious of a whole host of thinkers who had been kind of tangential to the things similar to what he was saying. He simply never mentioned and never really referred to it. And I wonder, what is this really symptomatic of? Is it maybe their training, which maybe wasn't so much in this history philosophy tradition, or is it perhaps the way philosophy had started to be done by already the 20th century, where it's more problem-centric? We have these problems, and now we sort of have to figure out a solution to them. And this historical perspective of being aware of what the people before us said is kind of being relegated to as an antiquity. And maybe this is something that has started to lack in the way philosophy is being done. And not just philosophy. I think humanities in general. And even science, this historical perspective of being aware of what are we grounded in, what has been said before, and to be able, because I think that's where most of the great ideas seem to come from, when someone discovers some old thought and then juxtaposes it with something new, and then you have this interesting fusion which enables jump forward. And maybe this is a little, we are doing ourselves a disservice by neglecting this historical perspective.
Yeah. Well, I think Whitehead and Varela are similar in the sense that they both came out of the sciences. And yeah, like you said, they didn't have historical training in the history of philosophy. But, you know, I guess it makes me feel better for not having read all the great thinkers that, you know, some of you are mentioning. There's just not enough time in the day, you know, but yeah, just because they're coming out of the science, they're the type of scientists, I guess Whitehead more mathematician initially, that they're, rather than dismissing philosophy as irrelevant, they recognized how significant philosophy is in shaping the imaginative background of different periods of history. And, you know, the question was raised, like, in Whitehead's new view of the universe and of, you know, science and philosophy, how do we distinguish between them? And it seems to me that it becomes a matter of just the specific and the general. There's more continuity. Science deals with specific problems. It develops specific jargons and research methodologies and paradigms, experiments, and specializes, right? And Whitehead wants to, in a way, by establishing this new role for philosophy as the critic of abstractions of the special sciences, seeking the general harmonization of all the special perspectives. He wants to liberate science to go further into those specializations, because he, you know, while without the role of philosophers to step back and keep the general picture in mind, specialization can be dangerous because it fragments knowledge. So Whitehead's saying, okay, philosophers need to play the role of critiquing the special abstractions, arriving at some general scheme that includes all of science, but also the rest of human experience and the arts and religion and so forth. But this allows scientists to freely go deeper